All right. Welcome, everyone. Give you guys a few seconds to get oriented. Just want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining this session on secondary traumatic stress and self-care. I'm Veronica Willeto-Decreen. I am with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I'm a training and technical assistance manager there. Dine Juan Slanen Eshlin, a Kedina Bashichin, Twitch Eatney Dashanella, Tretnasani Dashache. So I'm just sharing my clans in Navajo and just want to welcome all of you. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're here to talk about secondary traumatic stress and self-care with me today. And I welcome all of you. Just want to introduce a little bit more about the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We are based at the University of Montana, and which is in Missoula, Montana. I'm actually joining you guys from Billings in Montana, but our center is located in Missoula. And I put our mission statement up there because I really feel like that's something that we strive for as an organization. And it's to co-facilitate trauma-focused healing for Native children, families, and communities. And we really try to do that with understanding and in a respectful way, and also making sure that we honor tribal sovereignty. And we really look at the needs of communities. And so what we do is often tailored to the needs of communities. And we want to make sure that we honor that there are traditional ways of healing, as well as some of the Western-based approaches. So we try to balance that as well. So we are part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. We're a Category 2 trauma center, meaning that we provide training and technical assistance and not direct service. Category 3 trauma centers provide direct service. Category 1 centers are the 2 universities that focus on research and oversee this network that we're a part of. And we're able to be a part of that through a grant from SAMHSA. So that's a little bit about our center. I'm going to go ahead and share the objectives that we have for this session today. The first one, we just want to look at some of the terms that are used in when we're talking about how our work may impact us. And so we'll look at the term secondary traumatic stress, as well as other types of terms that are related. And then we're really going to look at what's, from a Western perspective, are those symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, but really we're kind of just going to look at some of the things that may be signs to us and may give us a warning that there's something going on with us and that we may be impacted by our work. And so we'll look at some of identifying and recognizing some of those signs. And then we'll also really talk about what happens when STS goes unchecked and when it's not prevented, or when it's not mitigated, when it's not treated, and so when it's not addressed in our schools. And so that's we'll look at some of the things that can happen, such as burnout and vicarious trauma. And then we will look at some strategies that may help us cope with stress, and we call them self-care. And so we'll review some of those and practice some of those as well. In fact, to get us started, we are going to practice a strategy known as deep breathing. And I'm sure this is not the first time that you've heard of this strategy. Maybe it is, who knows? but this is a very common strategy that is shared, deep breathing. And another term for it is box breathing. And so I'm going to go ahead and switch to a video that's going to lead us through an exercise of box breathing. So that was box breathing. Let me go ahead and pull up my slides. So if you noticed in the video, and hopefully you were able to follow along for that minute, and it's really an exercise where you breathe in very deeply with your stomach emptying, and then you hold it, and then you breathe out, and you hold it when you breathe out. So that's the exercise, and we use the count of 4 to kind of help us go into this pattern of deep breathing. So that's one exercise that you can use to cope with stress, that can be used in the moment, anywhere that you're at. So I wanted to go ahead and start with that. I do encourage you that if throughout this presentation you are feeling stressed by some of the things that we're talking about, that you practice deep breathing and or something else that might help you. So feel free to take care of yourself if you need to step away for a moment or something. But definitely this is a good strategy to use to help you deal with some of the stress that you might feel, either now or at any other point. So we are going to begin by talking about well-being, and I'm using the term Indigenous well-being because I think it's really important for us to understand those that we're serving. And some of you may be Indigenous people and some of you may not, but really getting an understanding of well-being and from the perspective of Indigenous peoples is really helpful. And so this is just something that helps me to better understand what that could look like. You know, growing up, I grew up on the Navajo reservation on the Eastern Agency side and in a small community called Ojo Encino. And that's, you know, my origins, and really helped to really shape the way that I think about well-being as I think about it now as an adult. And so, and I also continue to work with tribal communities today. And so this idea of Indigenous well-being is often at the forefront of what I do and what I think about. And so one of the things that I want to make mention of is that through an Indigenous lens, there are different aspects of well-being, and from more Western societies, what's emphasized that I've noticed is the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the social aspects of our well-being. So that spiritual aspect is also just as important as those other areas. But sometimes it doesn't really get talked about or isn't really brought to the forefront, especially in our workplaces. Our spiritual well-being and health may not be talked about in the workplace. And the other one is cultural aspect. So our identity and how it's shaped by customs and traditions are also just as important. And so that's something that I've noticed that isn't always mentioned or isn't always incorporated into our discussions when we talk about well-being. But I feel like it's really important to tribal communities and tribal peoples, their cultural identities and their spirituality. And one of the considerations about Indigenous well-being is that it's interrelated and interdependent. All of these different things work together. So one aspect of our well-being is when one aspect is affected, it impacts the others. There's also what I like to think about it as like different domains of our well-being. And again, from my observations and my thinking, it's oftentimes in more westernized societies, it's the personal domain and the professional domain and the organizational domain that really take precedent. So that our family life and our community life and the environment that we belong to and are in relationship with, those don't really get as much as attention. So once again, there's this interrelatedness, there's this interdependence, and how well, for example, our environment is doing affects how well we are doing. And then how well we are doing affects how well our families or our communities are doing. So because of this interconnectedness, it's very difficult, I think, from an Indigenous perspective, to silo these different aspects of well-being out. But today we are going to try and focus in on how our profession, the professional domain, impacts us, how it impacts us spiritually, culturally, socially, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And the goal is to also simultaneously hold up the understanding of that interrelatedness, interconnectedness of well-being, and how all these other domains in our life are impacted by and impact our professional one. So we're going to get started with talking about different terms that are used to describe the way in which our professions may have an impact on our well-being. The first one that I will mention is compassion stress. So compassion stress is when you want to go to work, you still value the job you do, and you want to help others. So you're going to work every day and trying to figure out how to help students, how to help your fellow educators, but you're experiencing stress during this whole process. Compassion fatigue is a term that emerged in the 80s and 90s, and it's pretty commonly used now when we want to talk about the impact our profession can have on us. It's closely related to the concepts of secondary traumatic stress that we're focusing on today. It's also related to the term secondary victimization and vicarious traumatization or vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue is when you have so much coming in as you are listening to the reactions of others that it begins to take a toll on you. And when we do that, when it begins to affect us, and it's added to already our own personal stresses that we may have in our life, we may become fatigued in helping students, in helping our colleagues, We may get tired of hearing the stories of trauma that they share with us, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to hear it anymore or we don't want to help. We still have a desire and a longing to help our colleagues and our students. So secondary traumatic stress, this term really comes from, was coined by Charles Figley, who's one of the pioneering researchers, and he defines it as the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing about a traumatizing event experienced by a significant other. So in this case, as educators, it's knowing about, hearing about an event that is being experienced by your students or by your colleagues, and the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. Service providers in many professional fields, including education, work with clients who have been directly traumatized. Often in the course of delivering services, the provider listens to and identifies with a client who experiences the traumatic event while they're describing it. So workers in these settings may develop symptoms that mirror PTSD. So some of those symptoms may look like they begin to have intrusive dreams or thoughts of the traumatic events. They might begin to have strong reactions to reminders of that event that come up during their day. They may begin to avoid the people, the places, or the activities that remind them of that event. And they may begin to change their mood and their thought process. So these symptoms interfere with physical, mental health, and they begin to cause problems in the personal lives of the workers, of these professionals, and in their relationships, and it begins to affect their job performance as well. So educators can also be exposed to direct trauma in the course of doing your work. So for example, some of you may have felt physically threatened by a student or a family member. I know, lockdowns happen in schools when someone is making a physical threat, but that's something that everyone in the building experiences, but it may be that you have an experience where that threat is being made directly to you. Or maybe you get another example during our time right now, and what's happening right now is with COVID. Maybe the case is that you got sick while at work from others at school, and battled a really serious case of COVID. So this vulnerability to both direct and secondary trauma can put us at heightened risk for job-related stress. So I want to talk about what happens when secondary traumatic stress goes untreated or it's not addressed. I think about it as there's a fallout that begins to happen. And this fallout, it doesn't just affect the worker, although that's really important for us to think about how it affects the worker, but it also affects those that educators are serving, and it affects the school as a whole. One of those fallouts is burnout. So burnout is a concept that's frequently used interchangeably with STS, but these concepts differ significantly, primarily because burnout doesn't really account for the experience of being affected by students re-experiencing trauma. So it's more about the environment of the workplace, and not really about the trauma that students are going through and educators being affected by that. But it often overlaps with STS. One of the ways it does that is that one, like burnout, can exacerbate when a educator is dealing with secondary traumatic stress. At the same time, an educator that's dealing with secondary traumatic stress, it may exacerbate their feelings of burnout. So if I'm burned out, what's happening is that I'm exhausted and I'm not really interested anymore in the work that I'm doing. And the only way that I can change that is to change where I work and what I do. So the cure for burnout is finding something new that lights our passion. There's numerous reasons why a person experiences burnout. We can refer to them as workplace mismatches. So these can be, educators that are overloaded in their work schedule. They may feel a lack of control, not being able to control all the changes that are happening. They may feel burnout because of breakdown of community that they're experiencing at work, maybe unfair treatment that they're experiencing, or maybe they're experiencing some type of conflict of their values. So all of these workplace mismatches can lead to symptoms of burnout, such as exhaustion, cynical detachment from their work, or feeling ineffective. Vicarious traumatization is another term that is often used interchangeably with secondary traumatic stress. It's often called vicarious trauma. But the differences between vicarious trauma and STS is that vicarious trauma, what happens is there's really an inner and a change in how a person inside of a person and how they view and see the world. So a person with STS may be impacted by hearing the stories or by what their students are going through, but they're really, but with vicarious trauma, it starts to really change how they see things. So when a person who's experiencing vicarious trauma, you can imagine if they're being immersed in the traumas of their students, it can start to affect their worldview, and it can have an impact on what they believe in the world about themselves or about the world or about their students or about others. We often talk about how trauma impacts students as being they start to develop an invisible suitcase of thoughts and beliefs and experiences that really affect how they see themselves and how they see the world. But that can also happen with educators. They can start to develop an invisible suitcase. And one of the biggest indicators that your invisible suitcase is being filled in a way that is negatively impacting you is when you begin to experience vicarious trauma. And there's a change in your inside of yourself that impacts your expectations of others and of yourself. And it can interfere with the level of compassion and satisfaction and comfort that you feel at your job. So the key characteristic of vicarious trauma that is similar to experiencing trauma directly is that it disrupts your spiritual beliefs. It disrupts your spiritual well-being. You may feel a loss of meaning and hope. And the symptoms may be less intense than experiencing direct trauma, but they're very similar symptoms. So with burnout, that can be the first sign that a person is going through secondary traumatic stress and it's starting to take a toll on them. But vicarious trauma is letting you know that there's something much deeper, there's a deeper impact that is happening to that person. So it's important to monitor how your experiences at work and how they're changing your worldview. So you, for instance, for example, you may have started out in your job having general faith in the goodness of others, but maybe, over the years you begin to be skeptical of others. You may not feel like there's goodness in humanity anymore. Maybe it starts to change your behaviors, and maybe you stop letting your kids spend a night over at their friend's house. Or maybe you begin to be desensitized to bad things that happen to people. So those are just some examples of how it can affect you. And so you can imagine how this can lead to an educator being ineffective. It can lead to an educator causing harm to students and families and colleagues. So when vicarious trauma goes untreated, it can grow into PTSD, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, substance use disorders. But one thing to make note of is this all sounds bad, but processing our empathy and expressing the empathy that we have towards others, towards our students, as well as any kind of personal stress that we're going through, can have the opposite effect as well. We can experience growth through that. So it's not just, it's not automatically going to have a negative impact on us, but it's really important for us to just be aware of this and to monitor ourselves when we feel like we're starting to feel those inner changes, inner experiences, and the expectations that we have of ourselves and others. So who's vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress? These are some things to think about if you're wondering if you're vulnerable, if others around you are vulnerable, or who to really check in on. So are you empathetic? Have you experienced a traumatic event in your life which is unresolved and is activated by reports that you hear or things that you hear when others are telling you about their pain or their trauma? Are you working directly with children and listening to their painful or traumatic experiences? So as educators, this may not always happen. Sometimes as educators, kids don't tell us. But sometimes they do, and they do open up to us. Do you help others and often neglect or unaware of your own feelings and needs? So if you're a helper, sometimes that's your identity, and you may tend to forget about yourself. You may tend to put others before yourself. And so these are just some things to think about in terms of being vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're a Native professional, there may be other factors that contribute to the likelihood that you might experience STS. So if you live in a small community that is comprised mostly of other Native people, if you are from the community you are working in, if you have close kinship ties in the community you work in, if there are few formal resources that treat secondary traumatic stress in the community that you work in, if you work in a community with high rates of trauma, if you or the students or community you work in are suffering from the effects of historical trauma. So these all cause a Native person, because they may be more likely to be exposed to trauma, or may more likely be working with students that are exposed to trauma. So, and may not have the support that they need. But at the same time, even though a Native educator who has close kinship ties in the community that they work in, that might put them in a vulnerable place to where they know exactly what their students are going through and the details of different families and what families in their community are going through, because it's their relatives that are going through that. At the same time, those kinship ties are also something that can help buffer against the impacts of secondary traumatic stress, because of that social support that we have through our kinship ties. So there's just different ways to look at this as well, but these are just some things to consider if you're a Native professional. And then there's the organization that you work for, right? We can only imagine that if there are multiple people in your school that are struggling with secondary traumatic stress symptoms, that this can have an impact on the organization and cause the organization to become stressed. But there's also the factor that organizations can create environments, can operate in a way that are a source of stress to their workers. And so they can have conditions, workplace conditions that can contribute to the stress levels that educators are experiencing. So both can be the case. So these are just some examples of common sources of stress that educators may have. If you've experienced any of this, or if you can think of other types of sources of stress that educators go through, feel free to add that to the chat.
We do have a few comments I'll share, Veronica. Spencer agrees. He says teachers deal with compassion fatigue almost every year. Amy said that she loves the differentiation between burnout and vicarious trauma, and thanks you for that. And then Enrique said, I love that when our curriculum is indigenized, it helps mitigate the fatigue and stress.
Mm-hmm. Love that. And when it's not indigenized, it can be a source of stress, right? That can also be the case. That is a common source of stress that specifically Native educators may experience, is having to work with a curriculum that isn't culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate, or that doesn't keep in mind the identity of their students. Thank you for that. So beyond just, because I think in any workplace that we may be a part of, any profession that we may be a part of, there's going to be stress, right? And we know that there's stress. As an educator, there's certain stresses that may come up for us. And it may be something that we may not have control over, eliminating that stress. But there's also sources that lead to a more severe level of stress, which is the secondary traumatic stress. And so these are just some examples of that. We've talked a lot about just listening to students' stories students that may disclose things to you about some of the things that they're going through. I know one of the most difficult ones that I've personally struggled with is knowing that a student is going to go back to a situation that may not be safe for them or good for them because of different reasons. And so there's not a lot of control that we have as educators over that sometimes. There's just different reasons why, where that secondary traumatic stress may come from. Maybe we had a student that really opened up to us and really what made us aware of some suicidal ideations or attempts that they were struggling with. So there's just different reasons why we may struggle with secondary traumatic stress, where that comes from. But it's with who we work with. Sometimes it can be even from our colleagues as well. If you're in a leadership position and you're hearing it from your employees and they're telling you secondhand stories, that can also contribute to that as well. So there's different symptoms or signs that can show up for us holistically. So this is just a breakdown of different ways in which we can be impacted by secondary traumatic stress, some of the signs and symptoms that we can exhibit. So physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to kind of read through this. Notice any signs or symptoms that pop out for you. Maybe that you've noticed in your workplace, maybe showing up. And as you're reading through these symptoms, I'm also going to refer you to the handout. It's called Zen to the End. And it's a handout that lets you think about maybe some of your own personal signs that you may be struggling with stress. And so it breaks it down from if you feel like you're doing well with your well-being in these different areas, different aspects of your well-being, it lets you describe what it looks like when you are doing well. So that's that Zen. And then it lets you describe when you're at a place that's more of like a warning place, like, let's be careful because I'm showing some signs that I may be struggling with my stress. And so it lets you describe what it looks like for yourself when you start to be in that place where you may need to be aware of the way that stress is affecting you. And then the end is where you're describing what it looks like when you're at the end of your rope and you're really experiencing some severe signs that you're struggling. So it looks differently for every person. So this is an activity that allows you to think through what it could look like for you and how you respond to stress. So I encourage you to take time to spend with that activity if you have a few moments this summer to really think through what it looks like to you when you feel like you're being impacted by secondary traumatic stress or by stress. So that's a good handout. Were there any comments about how different ways that we can be impacted by STS? Miranda?
Not at this time. We did have a question come in from Spencer, though, who is curious if you've done any research on historical trauma and its effects on DNA.
I have not personally. We do have we have a training on current impacts of historical trauma, and we have gathered some of that research that has been done so far around that, the impact on DNA, epigenetics. All right. So I'm going to ask you guys to share with me. So we're going to take a moment and just think about how stress affects us physically. Maybe one of the first signs that shows up for you is the way that stress shows up in your body, and your body starts to give you, notice that you're struggling with stress. And so maybe it's some of your thoughts that begin to show up, or maybe it's some of the aches and pains that you feel. Um, or maybe it's like some stomach issues that you begin to have, or just different ways that you start to see stress showing up in your body, and your body giving you that sign that you're dealing with some serious stress. So go ahead and share in the chat what that looks like for you.
We have some answers coming in. Michelle says her thoughts, definitely. Monica says she carries it in her shoulders. She gets tension headaches. Deborah has trouble sleeping. Craig tends to overreact to little things. And another head and thoughts.
A lot of thoughts. For me, it's aches and pains. I get the shoulder aches, the backache. So thank you guys for sharing that. Feel free to continue to share how stress shows up in your body. So we talked about all these different ways, aspects of our well-being that get impacted by secondary traumatic stress. And then as we're being impacted in these different ways, we begin to see our behaviors change. We begin to see how they change at home, in our personal life, in our home life, but maybe also at work as well. So these are just some examples of how our behavior can change in our personal life. So maybe we begin to change our routine. We might begin to withdraw, have nightmares. We might begin to engage in some self-destructive ways of coping. Maybe substance use, overdoing the substance use. We might begin to be prone to accidents, just being klutzy, accident prone. We might begin to be easily startled, have a change in our appetite, either get really hungry or just not even want to eat at all, not feeling like anything is appetizing. We might feel a decrease in energy. And then in our workplace, we might have a hard time completing our tasks on a daily basis. We might have a hard time meeting the deadlines that are set for us. And even when we are able to get those tasks done, get the job done, our performance might be very low quality. We might begin to have very poor relationships with colleagues, especially if we're withdrawing. We might struggle in our relationships with students, with their families. We may just begin to have overall a poor attitude at work. And STS specifically, as we talk about educators and the specific things that you deal with on a daily basis in your work, these are just some examples of the way that it can impact you at work. Maybe you have a really hard time dealing with some of the intense emotions of your students, of parents, of colleagues. Maybe it's just like something you can't handle their emotions. You may have a hard time just feeling like you're just not meeting that expectation you have of that excellence of teaching that you have. You may begin to be irritable with others and, maybe lash out at others. You might start to feel shame and guilt about not doing enough, especially in a helping profession, especially if you're a person that's empathetic. um, can start to feel like you um, should be doing better, that your performance should be better, and you may start to feel some shame and guilt around that. So there's another handout that I want to refer you guys to, and it's called the Balance Check-In. So we're gonna take a look at this for a little bit here. As a result of bearing witness to and attempting to help those suffering from trauma, our worldview can undergo some changes, and sometimes it's obvious changes and sometimes it's subtle. We can start to form new ways of thinking about the world, about ourselves, about our relationships, about how others see us. And we might begin to experience some disruptions in our balance. So part of that Indigenous way of looking at well-being is we try to balance all of these different aspects of our well-being, right? Because we know that they all impact one another. So we try to keep it balanced out. And we might begin to feel like they're not in balance, that we might be struggling a little bit. And so we can be impacted either negatively or positively by our work. And there's no shame and there's nothing pathological about being impacted negatively. So we're talking about STS, secondary traumatic stress. But we also know that even without a diagnosis like that, our workplace, our work that we do can start to impact us and push us out of balance. And so there's no shame in that. There's nothing to be afraid of admitting that. And so that's just something that happens to people in helping professions. And so one of the things that we can do is really reflect on our work-life balance, can reflect on our well-being. And so I'm just going to invite you guys to take a look at that first question. These are the questions that are in the handout, Balance Check-In. That first question, how has my work impacted how I see the world? And I'm going to invite you to take a few minutes. I'm going to give you some time to reflect on that question. And I encourage you to write down your reflection. Maybe this is a journaling activity. If you don't have pen and paper, that's okay. And you just want to take a few moments just to sit and think about this first question. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do that. So that first question, how has my work impacted how I see the world? An example of how it may have impacted you is maybe you're starting to see the world as being unfair. Maybe you're starting to see that the future of the youth that you work with is at risk. Or you may be feeling that the world is full of resilience and that youth are very resilient. So just those are just some examples. Take a few moments to think about how your work impacts how you see the world. So if some of you have written down some things, if you're comfortable and you want to, you can share it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll wait another minute.
We do have a response from Michelle. She says, my work has impacted my view of the world by seeing how much we need our youth, but even more so, how much they need us to be well in mind, body, and spirit. Very true. Thank you for sharing that, Michelle.
Thank you for that, Michelle. All right. So I'll go ahead and move us along, but I do, that handout is there for you if you want to continue to reflect on the balance in your life and answer some of these other questions about how your work may be impacting you. So we're now going to talk about, what do we do about this? What do we do about it when we notice that our jobs may be having an effect on us, that our stress level may be maybe not at a good level, maybe not at a place where we feel like we are able to manage. So there are specific things that can be done with a secondary traumatic stress diagnosis. But first of all, I think what we could mention is that there are some things that can be done to prevent secondary traumatic stress. So there's things that we could do around just educating everyone within an organization about what secondary traumatic stress is and how it affects people. And we can train in some skills that may help us to cope with some of the stress that we may feel when we hear when we're working with traumatized children and their families, and in communities with high levels of trauma. So there may be some skills that we could train in. There's also supervision. That's a key thing in an organization to really consider what type of supervision is needed to prevent certainly burnout and vicarious trauma, but from really the continual effects of secondary traumatic stress, or even preventing some of that from happening, although it can be difficult, right, when we're working with students to really prevent hearing from some of those traumas. But when we do, with supervision, we can have a plan of how to handle that and how to maybe debrief some of those things. So there's just different ways in which supervision can help. And it really involves, and the individual person within an organization, individuals. It involves that supervisor. It involves some of the policies that may be needed in order to address some of these things. But I also don't want us to forget about the untapped and unutilized wisdom and wisdom keepers that are within our tribal communities that can also help us in this area. There's some longstanding wisdom there that continues to exist and can help us understand how to deal with some of these traumas that are happening in our communities, but also how to deal with hearing about them, of listening to them happening. So those are just some things that we can do around prevention. And then I can't, because of the length of this presentation, I don't have time to really dive into some of the more specific. There are some ways in which you like screeners that you can do to screen your staff for STS. There's other things that you can do once you do identify that staff are struggling with this. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on what we can do to kind of mitigate those symptoms that we may be feeling, that stress that we may have, whether it's from, dealing some of the common sources of stress that educators deal with, or whether it's directly from some of the sources of trauma that come out of, secondary traumatic stress. So we're going to talk about just what can we do, right? And knowing that that's something that I was taught when I was growing up, that you're not, there isn't always, sometimes we feel like things are out of our control, or we don't know what to do. But there's also some teachings that we have in our tribal communities that really encourage us to think about what we do have control over and what we can do. And so that's what we're hoping for the rest of this presentation, that we can focus on, is what we can do. So my parents are on the screen. A picture of them, and they were the first people in my life to teach me how to manage stress. They had so much love for me that they were always reminding me to take care of myself. And so one of the famous reminders that they had for me is, don't forget to pray. So knowing that in my stress, I tend to forget to pray, and prayer is an important part of what helps me to cope with stress. There are also many times where in that moment that I was talking to them and sharing with them my stress, they prayed with me. So in our Native communities, Native love has become like a stereotype of abuse. And I know that tribal communities are trying to change that. So one of the ways that I think I try to contribute to that is to really talking about what Native love really is. And to me, this is Native love. Our relatives showing us that they care and reminding us to take care of ourselves. So what is your Native love story? I'd love for you guys to share that in the chat. So some examples of this might be, did you have an elder who reminded you to smudge, or told you a story that really helps you, a story that you like to think about when you're really stressed? Is there an uncle maybe who took you hunting, or an aunt who taught you how to bead? Do you have a tribal people in your life who taught you to think about how to deal with stress, to maybe taught you a few things, like some lessons, some strategies of how to deal with stress, or they really encouraged you to take care of yourself and your well-being and tried to show you how to do that? So if you're willing, feel free to share that in the chat, your Native love story.
Michelle has shared that her great-grandmother taught her the importance of respect and all that follows it when it is earned rather than demanded upon others to give it. And we
Yeah.
also had Enrique share that she doesn't mean to be negative, but that posing the question can also bring secondary stress to someone depending upon their experiences.
Yeah, and it could be a source of direct trauma as well, right? Um, so I encourage you to think about not just your own immediate family, but maybe just in general in life, people that were instrumental in helping you to learn how to cope with stress, or things that helped you learn how to cope with stress. Maybe it's not people, but how you learned that message that taking care of yourself is important. Thank you so much for that comment. Feel free to continue to add to the chat. I'm going to move us along because I know we have just a few minutes left. So one of the ways that I also like to think about, reducing stress, finding ways to tolerate some of the stress that we may find ourselves dealing with at work, or to even minimize some of those stresses, is really the medicines that are available to us, and really thinking about this from a holistic perspective. So the idea of gathering a basket of medicine, real or imagined, things that work for you, and a process that helps you plan, putting together a plan that helps you to make sure that you are using these different types of medicine. So there's another handout. It's a self-care plan that you can refer to. And so really thinking about your self-care plan as being holistic. So really looking at, so your spiritual well-being, cultural, social, mental, emotional, physical, and the different medicines that can help you stay well in those different areas of your life. So spiritual medicine, maybe some of those examples that you may find some that might work for you is ceremony. It could be going to church. It could be prayer, like I mentioned. It could just be reminding yourself of that sense of purpose that you have. It could be seeking awe, beauty, wonder, joy, maybe being in awe of nature. So whatever it is that your spiritual, your system of meaning is, and that nourishes you. So really looking at some of those different ways that you could really take care of your spiritual self, of your spiritual health. So cultural medicines that we might think about, maybe beading, some of those skills, cultural skills that we've learned, that we were taught, that really helps us feel connected to our identity and who we are. And maybe it's contributing to that perpetuity of our cultures, learning our languages, tribal languages, visiting some sacred sites that are important to our people, even researching your family tree or your tribal history, that, and being more aware of that and knowledgeable in that. So those are just some examples. There's also some social medicine. So how we foster relationship and community. Maybe it's spending time with one another. Maybe it's getting to know one another, sharing values, talking about our values and learning what's important to the other person, as well as sharing what's important to us. It could also be showing that you care, right? Showing that you care. And how do we do that? So during this pandemic, I was able to join a team at work that had not been a part of before. And so I only know them virtually. So we've only been working together virtually, and we were really missing that connection and that community that we probably would have built if we were working together, if we were seeing each other in person. But this is just one way that we try to build, get to know one another and have fun with one another. We used to do this, would you rather activity. So just an example is, would you rather live in the Arctic or Sahara Desert? Another one that we recently had was like, would you rather be a tiny ant or, like 15 feet tall, like, would you rather be super short or super tall? So it's just different things, and just kind of having fun, but also getting to know one another was one activity that we did at work. There's also some mental and emotional medicine, what helps keep your thoughts and emotions in check. So identifying what is going right, maybe gratitude, maybe trying to limit your exposure to trauma, if you feel like you have control over that. And then it could be, setting boundaries that can help you limit exposure, tuning into yourself, self-regulating, finding ways to self-regulate when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling triggered. So these are just some different ways that we can try to take care of our mental and emotional health. So physical medicine, how do you stay physically fit and healthy? Is it what you eat? Is it how you move? The exercise that you get? Is it water that is so life-sustaining to us? And we know is so important. Is it fighting for healthy water? Is it making sure you get enough water intake? Is it making sure you get enough rest, whether that's sleep or that's just taking a quick break, but making sure you get that rest that you need. Okay. So one of the examples that I'm going to share with you is another exercise. This is called progressive muscle relaxation. And I'm assuming that most of you are sitting in a chair of some sort. And so that's kind of how I am joining you all, is sitting in a chair. And so with this exercise, the goal is to tense a group of muscles and to hold it, and then for 4 seconds, and then to relax it. So we're going to go ahead and try that. So I'm going to invite you guys to get comfortable. So one of the ways that we might try to get comfortable is maybe we imagine ourselves not sitting in our offices or wherever it is that we're sitting. Maybe we imagine ourselves being in a place like that picture on the screen, someplace serene, someplace where we feel comfortable and relaxed. So just imagine yourself somewhere. If you need to close your eyes to do that, I invite you to go ahead and do that. So go ahead and close your eyes if you can, if you want to, and then take a deep breath. And we're going to go ahead and focus on our legs. So let's think about our left leg. Maybe one of the things that happens to you when you're feeling stressed is you start to feel some leg aches, or you start to feel like your muscles tense up in your legs. So this is a really good exercise to hone in on some of those areas where you feel stress. So let's think about our legs, our left leg, and go ahead and stretch it out as far as you can in front of you. As far as you can. Maybe there's a wall in front of you. I have a wall in front of me, but I'm stretching out my leg as far as I can. Okay, as you lift your leg up and you're stretching it out, go ahead and tense those leg muscles. Feel it tense from your calves, your thigh muscles. Just tense it up and hold it. Hold it really tight for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then relax. How does your leg feel? Does it feel tingly? Does it feel refreshed? Let's try it again in the other leg. Go ahead and lift up your leg, stretch it out, point your toes out as far as you can, and then tense those muscles in your legs, your calves, your thighs, tense them up real tight. Hold it for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then relax. So I don't know about you guys, but my legs feel like there's some life in them after sitting for so long. Doing that, it really does feel like my muscles are kind of awake a little. So that's what I encourage you guys to maybe consider progressive muscle relaxation. Maybe it's in your shoulders, maybe it's your hands and arms. I know sometimes I feel stress in my hands, especially from all the typing. So this is just another activity that you can do anytime and anywhere. And then you'll also notice that I did share some examples of self-care that you can do in the workplace. And this isn't just things that you can personally do, but it's also some examples of how your organization can support their employees with their self-care in their workplace. So something as simple as just having, water stations in the building can be something that can support a person's self-care. So just different things like that. So you can go ahead and take a look at those examples. And I also have a handout called Connect with Compassion Satisfaction that you can take a look at. And it really, one of the ways that is encouraged by those who may be struggling with compassion fatigue is really trying to remember how you maybe you used to have compassion satisfaction. You used to be satisfied with being able to help others, and this activity helps you connect back to that. And so I encourage you to spend some time with that activity. There's also another activity that's similar. This one is called Dwelling on the Good, and it also asks you to think about some good things when it comes to your job. So I invite you to take a look at that activity as well. And even though we talked about self-care and making a self-care plan, I do want to acknowledge that there can be challenges when it comes to self-care. The biggest challenge that I often can ignore is that there are real systemic and structural barriers, especially within organizations that really make it difficult. But as we hold that thought, I also want to encourage you to think about that teaching again of what's in my control and what I can do. And so think about some of those challenges that you might feel, that you might experience as you're trying to engage in more self-care, and as you're trying to carry through with your self-care goals or your self-care plan. And just kind of think about how you will handle some of those challenges. Some of them you can't you can't change, but there are ways that you can cope with them. And so there likely are ways that you can cope with some of those challenges. So I encourage you to think about that, um, even though it's easy to think about it in a negative way. And then I also encourage you to make a commitment, whatever that looks like for you. It could be that you need somebody to hold you accountable to making sure that you're taking care of yourself. It could be that it just helps to talk with your colleagues about what's working for them. Whatever it is that's going to help you stay committed to taking care of yourself in the workplace and in your personal life. So just think about some of those ways that you can be committed and stay committed to ensure that you're following through with that. So we did run out of time. So I just want to thank you all for your service and for just showing up every day for your students and for one another in your schools. I also want to just mention that you are the light, and that for those people who are going through their dark experiences. And so I just encourage you to keep that light shining. And so I hope you found this training helpful to you this afternoon. And then I just shared my contact information if you have any questions or want to follow up with me. And in the handouts, there's also a PDF of our trauma centers, training and technical assistance offerings. You can visit our website as well, but there's also that PDF that kind of describes different trainings that we offer and TA that we offer. So I will pass it back to Miranda.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for the very impactful presentation. I can tell from the chat box that our participants agree. Lots of people are thanking you. So relevant and helpful. I did share your email address in the chat box as well. So you can grab that if you'd like to reach out to Veronica later. You can also go to that Files tab to download a copy of her presentation and all of the handouts she was referencing. And then I'll make one quick request of you to please also visit that polls tab and complete the session rating before you go. Your feedback is really important to us. Thank you so much, Veronica.
Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of your day.